You're listening to the Football Scholarship Podcast, the playbook for parents and athletes who want to secure the best football scholarships possible. From securing a D1 football scholarship in the SEC at Ole Miss at just £5,700, myself, to helping 83% of the athletes I mentor achieve football scholarship offers and 42% going Division I. I've learned countless lessons that I'll be sharing right here with you. Join me and my co-host Brian Overton, who has 15 years of D1 college football recruiting experience, as we interview top experts, successful athletes, and discuss current recruiting trends. Together, we'll help you navigate the recruiting process so you too can achieve your dream of running out of that tunnel in front of 100,000 screaming fans. All right, Rick, so based on your experience, what are the most common misunderstandings athletes and their families have about the whole NCAA recruiting process? And, what's some advice you would give around some of these misunderstandings?
Well, I think the most misunderstood is, and of course, in football, you've got the different levels, obviously, of Division I, Division II, etc. So I think the most misunderstood is that you're going to have your scholarship guaranteed for 4 or 5 years. Now at the D1 level, there's more rules about that. There's more restrictions on what the coaches can do to not renew it. But at the other levels, but I think that's the biggest thing, is just that, my scholarship's guaranteed for 4 or 5 years, and hey, even in, as I'm sure even in situations where the rules pretty much require it, if a coach doesn't value the player anymore, the coach is going to, many coaches, I should say, they're going to kind of help shove the athlete through the door, toward the door. They're going to say, hey, your scholarship might be guaranteed, but if you ever want to see the field, you really ought to transfer and go somewhere else, because we don't see, now that we've had you in our program a while, we honestly just don't see you playing here.
Yeah, no, totally. A lot of people do think it's guaranteed. It's a 1-year contract. It's 1 year. So outside of that, what are some things, like if I'm a high school athlete, or I'm a parent of a high school athlete, when it comes to eligibility and some of the requirements, there's the kind of obvious ones as far as GPA, but I feel like that's also kind of changing as we speak. What are some of like the core requirements, eligibility requirements, that an athlete must have?
Well, for a high school athlete to be eligible for NCAA D1 or D2, and the requirements are slightly different, but basically during their high school career, they need to earn at least 16 core courses, is what the NCAA describes them as. Your typical college prep type courses: English, math, history, science, etc. You also have to do those in a certain timeline, and the NCAA has removed the requirement for an ACT or an SAT score. But many universities still need that for admission purposes, or also possibly to apply and qualify for an academic scholarship. So while NCAA doesn't require a test score anymore, it's still a good idea, because many universities might require that.
Yeah, and especially from a partial standpoint, like we had an athlete that got a partial scholarship, and they were able to give him more money based on how good his SAT, like the better his ACT score was, the more they were able to continue to give him, which was interesting, that if he would have never taken it, he wouldn't have been able to get more, even on a partial athletic scholarship.
Right. Well, I know when our son headed to college, this was a number of years ago now, but I know that particular university, if you scored a certain test score, you qualified for X amount. If you got a higher test score, you qualified for a higher amount, kind of like you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else, or is that it from a eligibility standpoint?
So basically, from an academic standpoint, it's needing to satisfy 16 core courses, minimum 2.3 GPA on a 4-point scale. As I mentioned, ACT, SAT score aren't required anymore. But I might add that it's also important to pursue those requirements, to try to satisfy those requirements, even if an athlete knows or is pretty sure they're going to be starting off at the junior college level, because you need those 16 core courses to be certified by the NCAA, and the term they use is a qualifier. To be certified as a qualifier, to be fully eligible as a freshman, to practice, to play, to receive an athletic scholarship. But even if the athlete is going to start off at the junior college level, it's still important to try to achieve qualifier status, because if you don't, you have more academic requirements imposed on you while you're at the junior college to then be eligible to transfer on to an NCAA school.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So that's important. So is there a difference between high school eligibility versus when you're transferring between different levels?
When you're transferring from one college level to another, well, as I just mentioned, if you're going from a JUCO to a 4-year school, there are certain academic requirements you have to satisfy there. If you're transferring from one 4-year school to another, the key requirement to kind of generalize things is you have to be eligible and in good academic standing at the time you leave school A to have the chance to be immediately eligible in your first year at school B.
Does high school matter at all at that point, or is it just what you did at that other at the school you're transferring from?
As long as you have, okay, so if you're going from one 4-year school to another, as long as you've spent at least one full academic year at school A, then your high school record in that situation won't matter. But if you're going from a 2-year college to a 4-year school, especially if it's NCAA, yes, then your high school academic record still matters, because as I mentioned earlier, if you're not a qualifier as determined by the NCAA Eligibility Center, then you have more academic requirements you have to satisfy while you're at the 2-year college level.
Okay. Got it. And then with the transfer portal and all of that, like, what are some of the things that you're seeing around that? Like with what is that? What are the rules with that? Like, I know now you could transfer anytime, right? Is that an area that you focus on at all, or
we provide a lot of consultations for athletes and families to help them navigate a transfer from one school to another. When it comes to the NCAA transfer portal, again, the rules are a little bit different between Division I, Division II, Division III, but the bottom line is coaches at other NCAA schools aren't allowed to have contact with an athlete or a family, or actually anybody on that athlete's behalf until the athlete's name appears in the transfer portal.
Yeah. So what's the deal with like this whole thing where athletes already know where they're going and the NIL amount before they even enter the portal? Is that just what's going on there?
That's the $64,000 question plus some, probably, Richie.
Got it.
You know, the rule if you look at the actual rule, you know, college coaches aren't supposed to be having any contact with the athlete, the family, or anybody on the athlete's behalf until the athlete's name appears in the transfer portal. Obviously, that's not the way it's working in reality, because, you know, as you mentioned, you see athletes that go in the transfer portal and 24 hours later, they're already announcing where they're going. So obviously there was some, you know, third party contact or whatever, but it's not permitted under the rules, but until people start calling each other out on it, it's probably going to continue.
Yeah. So what is there any like eligibility things or anything like that around the transfer portal that one must know about or understand that typically they don't know?
Well, so at the Division One, and I think a lot of people that follow college football know that in Division One, there's limited windows of time when an athlete can enter the transfer portal. You know, you can only enter it during certain times on the calendar. But there's exceptions for athletes who are not on scholarship at their school. There's also exceptions for athletes who will be graduating and are planning to transfer to use maybe their final year as a grad student somewhere else. So, you know, there are exceptions to that, but otherwise you've got those transfer portal windows.
Yeah.
D2 and D3 do not have transfer portal windows. Those athletes, for the most part, can choose to enter the transfer portal whenever they're ready. Now at D2, they do have a deadline of June 15, but anytime up until then, it's their choice.
But when can they enter after June 15th?
So if an athlete, okay, so let's take an example of a D2 athlete who's going to transfer to another D2 school. If they enter after June 15, they're probably not going to be eligible in their first year at another D2, because you have to enter it by that date. So those dates are a condition of what's called the one-time transfer exception. I know you've heard of that term. You know, a lot of people know the one-time transfer rule. One of the conditions to be able to use that is you have to enter the transfer portal within the appropriate time period.
Yeah, but now there is no one time anymore. You can go as many times as you want.
Well,
Crazy.
there are still rules limiting a second time transfer, but at the D1 level, they're under, those rules are basically under a court injunction right now where they don't apply. Whether that court injunction continues or whether the NCAA changes their rules as a result of that, I can't predict that.
It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, it's like mayhem right now.
Yes, it
so
is.
What about NAIA? Are they the same as D2? Oh, I know it's not NCAA, but can they transfer at any time as well? How does that work?
NAIA is, and I'll throw out a caveat here. I'm not as knowledgeable about the NAIA rules as I am about NCAA, because my career on campus was all at two NCAA D1 programs. With that said, NAIA, in most cases, you can transfer to an NAIA, and as long as your academics are in order, you can be immediately eligible. Worst case scenario, if you go to an NAIA, let's say a player leaves their first 4-year school after the fall, and they're going to go to an NAIA school.
Okay.
Worst case scenario, I believe, is they have to sit out for 1 semester, which is different than NCAA. If you're not eligible to be immediately eligible, you're out for you have to sit out for competition for one full academic year. That's one of the key differences between NCAA and NAIA.
But can NAIA transfer into NCAA and they'd have to sit out a year?
As long as they meet the academic eligibility requirements and it's their first transfer, an NAIA guy could transfer into an NCAA program, have the chance to be immediately eligible.
Got it. Okay. Okay, cool. And then from there, let's say in a year later, they wanted to go to another, let's say they went from NAIA to D2, and then after a year, they wanted to go to D1. Could they do that?
So if we set aside this court injunction thing for a minute,
Or you could transfer as many as you want.
they would have to sit out so an athlete in that scenario, NAIA to D2, then wanting to go D1, that player would be required to sit out from competition during their first year unless they had not received a scholarship at the D2 school, because D1 has another transfer opportunity called the non-scholarship transfer exception. Even if you've already transferred once, if you're not on an athletic scholarship at school number 2, you would have the opportunity to use Division I's non-scholarship transfer exception to be able to be immediately eligible at a D1 as school number 3.
Oh, dang. But if you are on scholarship on the D2, then it depends on this junction
Yes.
But let's say they're still rolling with it and you can transfer as many times as you want, then essentially they could.
Essentially they could. Then the question becomes, do they meet the academic requirements to be eligible as a transfer?
And what are those?
To put it in real general terms, Richie, and if you want me to get a little more specific, I can, but to put it in real general terms, the more times you transfer, the harder it can be to satisfy the transfer requirements, because you almost always lose some academic credits when you transfer from one school to another. And if you don't have enough academic credits that are accepted as transferable to the new school, then you may not be academically eligible.
Got it. Okay. So do a lot of like D1 athletes who are like, thinking about entering the portal, is that who reaches out to you? Like who typically reaches out to you?
We get a lot of athletes in all sports, but we get a lot of athletes who are considering a transfer. They may not want to go to their compliance person at their school and ask questions because they're concerned word's going to get back to their coaching staff. So they'll find us online, they'll call us, and they'll ask for a consultation to basically explain all the steps and rules involved in a transfer, so that they know and are prepared when they go ahead and make that move, that they know what to expect and what to be prepared for.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Okay. Do you ever get like any big name guys on the football side? Where they hit the portal?
We've had a few over the years. We've had a few. Yeah.
That's kind of cool. Okay. And what are some of like the main questions that those guys ask? Like, what are some of when they jump on, obviously it's interesting. They don't want to go to their compliance director, because then that guy could just go to their coaches and say, hey, he's interested in transferring. That's a real thing.
Yeah.
What are some of like
hey, let me add, as a former compliance director myself, I do not want to put all the compliant. I do not want to paint a bad picture of the compliance folks, but the bottom line is, athletes sometimes aren't sure who they can trust, and they're not sure whether a conversation in one office is going to be confidential and whether it's going to get back to their coaching staff or not And so, they start looking for answers online, and often they find our website.
Got it. What are some of like the big questions that they're trying to get answered?
Well, number one, they want to know if their scholarship is still safe or not, or for how long. A
Is
lot of
it?
times I'll come back to that in a minute. A lot of
Okay.
times what the parents want to know is, the application deadline for admission to this other school is in March. Our son can't enter the portal until April. How does that work to apply for admission to other schools, that sort of thing. So back to your question about the scholarship. Again, the rules are a little bit different between the different levels. Division I, an athlete's scholarship would, as long as they are keeping their good academic standing, and as long as they're not getting in any trouble off the field, away from the field, their scholarship would be good until the end of the semester when they enter the portal. So in other words, if they enter the portal in late November or December, their scholarship's probably only going to be good until the end of that semester.
Right.
Now
So
for D2, however, the scholarship would be allowed to continue through the end of the year. But in reality, a lot of those guys are going to leave after the first semester anyway, because as I'm sure you can understand, they want to get to the new school to go through spring practice with their new team.
Yeah, but how many players? I mean, there's a lot of players that enter the portal and it doesn't go well. Like they don't ever get another they don't get another scholarship. Is their other scholarship gone?
Yes, most likely. Yep. I mean,
Wow.
once that semester or that school year is over, if an NCAA athlete has put their name in the portal, there's no requirement that the university continue it the next year, even if the athlete would choose to return.
Interesting. So it's really like it's based on the relationship with the coach, whether they're going to give it back or not.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So this is a bit unfair, right? So players are taking a huge risk without being able to speak with coaches. Can the players reach out to coaches of other schools but the coaches can't reach out to them, or is it both ways?
Technically, the athletes are not supposed to reach out to coaches until their name is in the portal. If they do that, the coach on the other end of that text or that email should be responding, according to the rules, should be responding to say, hey, thanks for your interest. I can't talk to you until your name's in the transfer portal.
Wow. That puts the athlete in a pretty tough spot. Like they're taking a big risk if they're not able to.
They are. There's no doubt that transferring can be very risky, because you may, the situation you're in may not be great, but you could possibly end up in a situation that's not even, maybe you may be worse off than what you had.
Yeah.
So yes, it is. Yeah. Considering a transfer can be risky.
What are some of the other questions that typically transfers? Because these are good. I didn't even think of them. Are there any other big ones that typically come up?
Well, I mentioned the admission deadline.
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, a lot of schools, not all schools, but a lot of schools, it's possible for the athletic department to help an athlete get admitted into the school, even if it's after a normal application deadline. And by the way, I don't think at a lot of schools, that's not just the athletic department. I mean, like the music department, the drama department, I think at many schools, they can still work with the admissions office to say, hey, this is an extraordinarily talented performer. Can they get admitted even though it may be after the standard deadline?
Okay. Interesting. Okay. What about high school kids? Like, this whole June 15th deadline, right? Coaches of your junior year, coaches can reach out to you, can't reach out to you, but you can reach out to them, right? Do you get a lot of people that ask you questions around that? And how does that actually work?
Now, that is a question that we really don't get that often.
Okay.
And
Really?
it's largely because kind of as I was telling you in our introductory conversation, we don't get a lot of recruiting questions. The bulk of ours are about eligibility, transfers, medical hardship waivers, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. What do you mean by waivers? Is that meta?
Like a medical red shirt, athletes or families asking, does my son, he got injured, he missed some games, does he qualify for? A lot of people call it a medical red shirt. The official NCAA terminology is medical hardship waiver.
Got it. Okay. So when you were working with the NCAA, you were the director, right? Like what the compliance director. It was at two specific schools?
I was a compliance director at a school in the Big Ten and one in the Big 12 earlier in my career.
Oh, that's awesome. And so I always like to look at things from like the coach's perspective when it comes to recruiting. And for you, like from the compliance director's perspective when it comes to being eligible. So what were some of the core, like, as a director, like what did you focus on when it came to working with the athletes? What was that role like?
Well, that was quite a few years ago because we've now been doing informed athletes for 16 years.
Oh, dang.
But and of course, back then the transfer portal didn't exist, but there were transfer forms that I called them transfer questionnaires. So I'd have a transfer questionnaire, I'd send it to the other school. Hey, tell me about this athlete. They'd send it back. I'd check it over, see how many seasons of eligibility the athlete had remaining. Are they in good academic standing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the main thing nowadays that now with the transfer portal, all that information is submitted online. So like if an athlete is transferring from my school to yours, and if you're the compliance person at the other school, I'm going to answer those questions in the transfer portal. And when you look at that player's profile, you'll see how many seasons of eligibility has the athlete used. Were they on scholarship at our school? Are they in good academic standing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I think, you asked me what would the main thing I'd be looking at is I'd probably be looking at their transcript. Do they have enough credit hours that transfer to satisfy those requirements?
Got it. Okay. Awesome. And is there anything that an athlete should know about the whole compliance department that most don't know that would help them?
I think the one bit of advice I'd share, and when I say this, I don't mean to any disrespect due to coaches, but if you think about it, coach's main emphasis is not about the eligibility rules or whether you're going to qualify to be eligible as a transfer athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, their primary interest is in coaching the players on the field.
Mm-hmm.
If athletes are getting their rules information from a coach, I would strongly encourage them to confirm that with the compliance person at their school, because the coach may not know the latest update from the NCAA, or a coach may have just been hired at a D1 school, but they were previously at a D2 school and the rules are different. So I would just say, hey, if you're being told something about your eligibility, whether it's academic eligibility requirements, whether it's how many seasons of eligibility you have, I would encourage athletes to check with the compliance office because those are the authorities on that.
Got it. Okay. And so if an athlete is interested in connecting with you and has some questions around compliance and eligibility, what's the best way to connect with you?
Our website is informedathlete.com. We post a lot of blogs there and stuff that they can look at. They can also contact us through our website, or they can contact me directly, Rick at informedathlete.com.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Rick, is there anything else that you want to share that I missed that could be helpful?
So, yeah, actually, there is one thing I'd like to share because we've been getting a lot of questions, especially since COVID. We've been getting a lot of questions from athletes and parents. Well, here'd be a scenario. So our son is dealing with mental health issues and, you know, he's just totally stressed out. And it's been this way since he started in college during COVID. He was isolated. He could only leave the dorm to go to practice. You know, he couldn't sit in person in class. All that stress, it's been weighing on him.
Yeah.
He's had a lot of, you know, his stress on his mental health. Our question is, can he qualify for a medical hardship waiver for mental health issues? And that is possible. But what I've been sharing with a lot of our clients and families who contact us is, in my opinion, so first of all, know that hardship waivers, and again, what a lot of people call a medical red shirt, hardship waivers, an athlete can't request that on their own. School has to request that for them. Another thing is, I've advised families, you need to think, if your son or athlete is going to try to gain a medical hardship waiver for mental health issues, I believe you need to think of it as if it's a physical injury, like a torn ACL or a torn labrum. You need medical documentation that is strong enough to convince the NCAA that your athlete was impacted to such a degree that they could not compete for their team beyond the halfway point of the season. And in fact, I might add, so, and this is also true so these are the three basic guidelines for an athlete to qualify for a medical hardship waiver. And it's basically true for NCAA, junior college. NAIA is a little bit different, but basically you can't compete in more than 30% of the games in your season. You can't compete beyond the halfway point of the season. And again, you have to have strong medical documentation that basically says this injury or illness is so serious, this athlete cannot play the rest of the season.
Okay. That's really good information, because I feel like that's something that has come up quite a bit, especially over the past 2 years, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a good point, and I would have never thought to bring that up. So, good stuff.
Hey, pleasure to share that, and thanks for the opportunity to chat today.
Yeah, no, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and maybe hopefully we'll be able to get to have you on again in the future.
I'd be happy to do that.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Rick.
You bet. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football Scholarship Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. And for more free resources, or if you're interested in working with us, visit gonextplay.com. Until next time.